Chapter 28. Aran. It took until they were halfway to the compound before Aran's brain started functioning again. Ines and Nicolau were clearly trying to be respectful and also were clearly trying very hard to bite back smiles. He honestly couldn't have cared less. Istve had kissed him. Istve had said... His brain shorted out any further thought. It didn't matter. They were going to talk about things, finally, when he got back from this. If he got back from this, which meant he was damn well determined that he would get back from this. At last, they reached the place overlooking the security compound, where he and Istve had sat a few hours before. Behind them, he could still hear the sounds of the raiders fighting, the shrieks and screams and the hiss of weapons. He took a deep breath and shook his head to clear it, then pulled out his binoculars, dialing them in. Then he swore. What is it? Inez's voice was as timid and worried as ever, but he knew damn well that didn't have any effect on her ability to do what needed to be done. Looks like they've noticed the raiders, he whispered. Nicola glanced back as a large explosion blossomed above the treetops. It's probably hard not to at this point. Aran nodded grimly. You're right, but it's not going to make this any easier. He paused. Give me a minute. He brought the binoculars back up to his eyes. It was, well, honestly, even worse than he'd been expecting. The guards were scuttling around like insects, weapons ready, everyone on full alert. All right, he said at last, lowering the binoculars. Ines and Nicolau were watching him, their gaze eager and trusting, and he had to refrain himself from cursing. He wasn't a leader. He didn't want to be. He was a damn scientist. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to tamp down the creeping panic. Ani gave a little chirrup, moving restlessly on his shoulders, and he rubbed her head to calm her. If we keep to the trees, we can get around to the back of the compound. It looks like they've cleared the area around it, but in the back right corner, it looks like there's a dark spot between the spotlights. We'll have to get through the force field and then through the fence. But I think it's our best bet at this point. Nicolau and Ines nodded, that trace of hero worship in both their gazes. Aran swore under his breath. The three of them crept through the cover of the trees towards the brightly lit compound. The spotlights lit the night, their brightness dampened only slightly by the force field surrounding the outer walls. They reached the edge of the trees and paused. Aran gritted his teeth and sighed. Damn it to hell, he was rubbish at telling people what to do. Okay, he whispered. I'll go first, you follow. Ani's acid does a lot of things, but it's not going to get us through a force field. I have an emergency disruptor, but it doesn't work very well on Yibo force fields either, so we'll have to think of something else. Wait, said Nicolau, his face brightening. Listen, when Savina and Benny and I were back with the Yibo criminals, they used to have to get through force fields all the time to get into places. They used something that was similar to a disruptor, and I think I remember how to do it. He glanced at Aran. If you don't mind me trying, he added awkwardly. I mean, I'm sure you already know No, please, go ahead, Aran broke in quickly. Nicolau flushed, looking simultaneously wildly excited and hideously embarrassed. We're going to have to get right up to the force field, and it'll take me a minute or two after that. Aran nodded. All right, he said. It looks like the guards come by on a 5-minute rotation. So, from the looks of it, taking the sight lines into account, we'll have about 2 minutes. Is that enough time? Nicolau frowned dubiously. It should be. If you have a pair of cutters, I can probably get us through the fence, said Ines. Aran fumbled in his pouch, pulling out a small pair of cutters. Will this do? Ines nodded, swallowing hard. All right, said Aran, fighting back his sick terror. We'll go in as soon as the next guard turns the corner. Nausea churned in his stomach. He might get them killed. They might get into trouble he couldn't get them out of, and it would be his fault if they died. He took a deep breath. No point thinking about that right now. Focus on the task ahead. Focus on the guard on top of the wall. Now, he hissed, and the three of them darted forwards. They reached the wall moments later, and Nicolau took the device Aran handed to him and pulled a utility knife from his belt. He shoved the knife into the mechanics of the disruptor, prying it open. He was working steadily, his hands sure, but Aran could feel the sweat beading the back of his neck. They must have used at least 30 seconds already. The device popped open, and Nicolau shoved it against the outside of the force field, pressing it to the translucent surface. A small crack appeared in the glowing field, and he pushed the tip of his utility blade through it. "I need something to pry it open," he hissed, and Inez snatched up a stick from the ground, handing it to him. Nicolau jammed it into the space, then dragged the device down the surface of the force field, running the sharp blade of the knife after it until there was a long, thin crack held open by the branch. Then he shoved the knife back into his pocket, braced his feet, and put his weight against the branch, the force field straining back against the edges of the wood. "In," he whispered, his voice strained, and Inez glanced at him, then slipped through the crack. Aran took the branch from Nicolau. "You next." Nicolau looked conflicted, but when Aran gestured again, he did as he was told. Aran braced the edge of the stick against the ground, then slipped through, tapping the stick with the toe of his boot as he went. The stick sprang free, and the force field snapped shut again with the three of them inside. Aran bit back a curse. They were crammed into the narrow few centimeters between the force field and the razor wire fence. He could already hear the sound of the guard's footsteps. "Got it," hissed Inez, and he turned in surprise to see that she'd already managed to cut a long, neat slice down the wire of the fence. Nicolau ducked through the opening, and Aran did the same, Inez close on their heels. Aran glanced quickly around, then shoved the other two behind the shelter of a small outbuilding and threw himself down after them, just as a guard rounded the corner. For a few moments, they lay there panting, their breathing sounding harsh and loud in Aran's ears. Ani growled softly from her perch on his shoulders, and he gave her a reassuring pat. "Easy, sweetheart, you're such a brave girl. But we probably shouldn't pick a fight right now." The guard didn't seem to notice anything amiss, just kept on her way, and Aran let out a long sigh of relief. "All right," he whispered when she'd turned the corner out of sight. "I've got a couple detonators, but we'll have to figure out where to plant them, because if we don't take down the mechanism completely, we're not getting another chance at it." Nicolau and Inez nodded gravely as Aran took a quick scan of the building layout. The problem was, he had no idea what the mechanism looked like or how it worked. His best guess was that the majority of the compound was dedicated to providing a power source, but where the hell would he need to plant an explosive to take out the mechanism itself? He took a deep breath. "I guess we start at the main building and try some reconnaissance." The three of them waited until the coast was clear, then scampered quickly to the shelter of the next building. Their progress was agonizingly slow. Aran could still see dim flashes of light through the force field that must be the raiders fighting, and he wondered for a hysterical half-second what would happen when they figured out the humans they'd been fighting over were gone. At least it was distracting the Yibo guards' attention. They should have been caught at least twice, but both times the guards were so busy trying to see what was happening outside that they paid no mind. At last, they stood in front of a side door, Nicolau and Inez looking around nervously as Ani spat, and the lock mechanism steamed and hissed. Aran pushed the door carefully, and it swung open. He glanced inside, then beckoned the others in, blinking in the dim light. Then he groaned. The building was a maze. It would take them hours to search this place. Inez made a soft, startled sound, pointing to the wall. "The diagram! On the wall! The program I wrote won't read it, because it looks like it's a lot of numbers and symbols, but I might be able to decipher it myself, if you can give me a minute." She crossed quickly over to the diagram. "Nicolau," Aran whispered, "get your weapon out. If anyone sees us, we'll need to keep them occupied until Inez is done." Nicolau nodded, pulling out a small pulse pistol. Aran did the same, moving to stand on one side of the hallway, while Nicolau took the other. Inez frowned over the diagram, her lips moving silently. Aran could feel the tension building in his muscles, but he fought it down. At last, her face brightened. "It looks like the mechanism is underground, and I know where the entrance is," she whispered. 2 buildings down from here. By the time they reached the small building Ines had indicated, and Ani had melted the lock on the door, Aran could sense a change in the atmosphere of the place. Guards calling to each other, running footsteps, barked orders. "Istvay?" he began through his wavelink. Then he remembered, abruptly, that Istvay's wavelink wasn't working. It was odd how the thought made his stomach sink. He took a deep breath. Get this done, and get out. That was all. Don't think about the fact he was on his own, without even Istvay's comforting voice through his wavelink, or the fact that the Chief Justice and the entire Joias System were depending on him. He couldn't think about any of that right now. Just get in. Get this done. Get out. Whatever was happening outside, it must be something big. There was the sudden blare of an alarm, then another, more pounding footsteps from outside the building. "We don't have much time," he hissed as they slipped inside. "Ines, do you have any idea what the mechanism looks like?" She shook her head. "The diagram didn't say anything about that." He forced himself not to swear. "Well, I'm sure there'll be some sort of signage on the machine itself. Maybe we can work it out from there." There was nothing but empty rooms on the main floor of the building, and they located the stairwell easily enough. When they reached the bottom and stepped through the doorway, Aran stopped in astonishment. The machine was huge, stretching out in a massive snarl of technology through an impressive underground bunker. He groaned. Ines had already moved to one corner of the machine and was reading through the signs. Nicolau had gone over to help, although from the looks of it he was being less helpful than he thought he was. Aran scanned the room quickly. This was going to take forever. And it would probably not take forever for them to be found out. He grabbed a large metal stool, wedging it firmly behind the door. It might give them a few extra moments, at least. He closed his eyes for a moment. The tension was a hard knot in the pit of his stomach, and he felt a bit like he was going to throw up. The noise from outside was growing louder, and he could hear guards shouting. And then there were footsteps on the stairway outside. He cursed. "Ines!" She looked up at him, her eyes frantic. I'm sorry, Aran, I haven't—" "It's fine," he hissed. "Just get away from there. Get down." A fist slammed against the door, and Aran's AI translated, "Why's the door shut? Who's in there? Answer me." There was a moment's pause. Then the voice shouted, "Sound the alarm! Someone's in the machine room! Send in backup!" Aran looked around frantically, then beckoned Ines and Nicolau over, pushing them down behind a large crate. It wouldn't do much, but it might protect them from the first wave of shots. The Yibo were pounding on the door. Aran took a deep breath. He could still feel Istvay's kiss on his lips, see the look in their eyes as they pulled away, heavy with longing. "Come back to me, okay?" He yanked out the 2 detonators and shoved one into Ines's hand and one into Nicolau's. "You stay hidden. I'm going to try to get out and signal Istvay for a distraction. When it's safe, keep trying to figure out where to plant the detonators. Understand?" "But," Nicolau began. "Just do it, okay?" Aran whispered. And if you get back and I don't, tell Istvay—" He paused, swallowing hard. "Tell them I'm sorry." He stood, making his way at a crouching half-run towards the door. He reached it and positioned himself against the wall where it would open. The Yibo guards were still pounding on it, and someone shouted, "Stand back!" There was a crackling, electric buzz, and the door dissolved. The Yibo burst in, stumbling over each other. Ani hissed, and the Yibo closest to Aran stumbled backwards in alarm. Aran yanked the guard out of the way, dove past her, and pounded up the stairs. There were shouts behind him, but the Yibo wouldn't risk shooting their atomizer weapons in here, not this close to the machine they'd been working so hard to protect. He stumbled out into the courtyard, slapping the base of the flare against his thigh, and held it up. A brilliant red flame blossomed into the night, flattening against the force field. A shot whizzed over his head, and he dropped the spent flare and dived to the ground as another shot impacted against the building behind him. Then he scrambled to his feet and ran, blindly, not caring in which direction. Chapter 29. Savina. Savina paused for a moment outside the cockpit of the ship, wiping blood from her knife blade. Reka stood close behind her. "Vina, is that you?" Benny's voice came from inside as the door slid open. Savina barely had time to answer before Benny launched himself at Savina and grabbed her into a tight hug, burying their face in Savina's shoulder. "Vina, I was so worried about you." For a moment, Savina was too stunned to react, and then she wrapped her arms around her sibling, and Benny clung to her, and for a moment she was just a kid again, before the whole world had become cold and complicated. "What the hell happened to you, Savina?" Savina jerked her head up at the dangerous tone in Joska's voice. Then she remembered and glanced down, wiping blood from her face with her sleeve and swallowing back the nausea at the bloody mess that was her leg. "Reka!" Joska's voice had gone, if possible, even more dangerous. "Did you do this to her?" Savina blinked at Joska. The woman's expression was hard and so stern that even though her gaze was focused on Reka, Savina found her brain automatically searching through her own actions of the past few weeks to figure out what she should be apologizing for. Reka looked, for once, completely nonplussed. Benny pulled back. "Vina, are you hurt?" They spun on Reka as well. "Reka Solar, I swear to you, if you touched my sister—" "No," Savina stammered. "It wasn't her, it was the Yibo, and anyway, it's not as bad as—" Joska shot her a look that told her as clear as words what she thought of the excuse, then turned back to Reka. "I expect an explanation." Savina stared at Joska, unsure she'd heard correctly. Reka was still staring as well. Rafael had limped out from the cockpit and was glaring at Reka over Joska's shoulder. "Well?" said Joska in that infuriating tone she had, that managed to convey both stern disapproval and a sincere belief that you could do better. It was gratifying to hear that tone turned on someone other than Savina, for once, and for the first time in her life she caught Reka looking faintly sheepish. "I'm sorry," the woman said at last. Savina almost sputtered in astonishment. "You're right. She presented me with the plan, and I was angry, and I didn't sufficiently consider the risks when I agreed to it. I was negligent, and I apologize." Reka must have seen the look in Joska's eyes because she turned to Savina. "I apologize, Savina," she said quietly. "I didn't mean for that to happen to you. I didn't take the precautions I should have. That is my own fault, and I'm truly sorry you suffered the consequences of it." There was a sincerity in her tone that Savina hadn't expected. Savina couldn't do anything but blink at her. Reka gave Savina a small, wry smile and turned back to Joska. "So, Joska, I assume you have a plan?" "I believe I do," said Joska. "I know Savina can work ship's guns. I assume you can as well? Well, you're right. An explosion on the loading dock would take out a few ships. I think we'll be better served if we can keep them from getting off the ground in the first place. Perhaps damage the infrastructure as well. We won't have to keep them occupied permanently, just long enough for our famous adventurer, Aran, to get the portal mechanism taken down." "Aran Romo? Aran Romo is working with you?" Savina glanced over and caught a glimpse of admiration on Reka's face that was entirely unexpected. Joska smiled a little. "He is, he and Istve. Or, working with Alba, at least. When I left, the two of them had just made their escape from some raiders they'd tracked down and convinced to help them with genetic analysis, from what I understand. As far as I've seen, Aran is more or less exactly what the rumors paint him to be. I have no doubt between him and Istve, they'll figure it out." Savina had never expected to see a tinge of something like hero worship on Reka's face, but then she'd seen a hell of a lot of unexpected things in the past few hours. It took them only a few minutes to get situated. Reka and Savina in the gun tower, Joska in the pilot seat, Rafael as co-pilot, and Benny navigating. Savina was absurdly grateful that Joska had managed to talk Nicolau into staying behind. Not that it was that much less dangerous there than here, from what Joska had said, but she couldn't imagine it being much more dangerous. "I'm no trick pilot," said Joska, quietly, into the amplifier. "I can fly us a straight course, and I can keep us pointed at the target, but that's about my skill level. Benny? What have you found for the shields on this thing?" "I found how to set them up," said Benny, their voice tight with worry. "I have the specs on their relative strength, but I'm not familiar with Yibo measurements, so I don't have any idea what it means realistically." "Well, we'll do what we can," said Joska. "I'll do my best to keep us from being hit. But Savina and Reka, this will fall mostly on you. You'll have to disable ships and take out all the infrastructure targets you can, and you'll have to keep them busy enough that they're focused on defending themselves instead of attacking." "From what we saw on our way in, this is mostly an air-based offensive," Rafael grunted through the wavelink. "They don't seem keen to land troops on Colorida, which makes sense for what we know of their motives. They'll want a show of force, not an actual war. So, as far as I'm concerned, take out the biggest guns you can find. The moment they no longer look intimidating, they'll start having second thoughts about going ahead with this." "Rafael's right, I think," said Joska. "I don't know how long we'll last. I don't know whether or not this will be effective, and to be honest, I'm not even sure what's happening back with the others. But we'll do our best to buy them some time." She paused a moment. "And Savina," she added, "you know how I feel about unnecessary casualties." Savina rolled her eyes from habit. "Only kill if you have to, blah, blah, blah," she grumbled. But she found she was smiling. She could hear the smile in Joska's voice in response. "Very good. I knew you were a quick learner." She paused again. "Are you ready then?" "I'm ready." Reka's voice was as calm as always. "I'm ready too," said Savina shortly. Her hands were still shaky, and she wasn't sure whether it was the shock of the injury or the shock of the rescue, or something else entirely. Reka glanced over at her. "Are you all right?" she asked. Savina scowled. "I can do what I need to. I know damn well that's all you care about." Reka frowned. "Savina," she said at last. "Your captain friend was right. We were working together. And as much as I might have personal disagreements with you, that carries with it a degree of responsibility. I'm sorry, "Shut up," Savina said through gritted teeth. "I'm not your responsibility. I don't need your damn pity. We pretended we cared about each other because we both needed to stay alive. You don't have to pretend anymore. Joska's not stupid enough that you can fool her like you fooled Kachik, and nor am I." Reka raised her eyebrows, but said nothing. Savina turned back to the gun controls. "Joska!" she snapped. "Benny's sending me the information," said Joska, "and we're moving. Hold on, this might get interesting in a hurry." Savina settled herself into her seat as the ship lifted off the ground. She could hear the shouts through the cockpit radio, her wavelength translating the Yibo's consternation. "Paging ship 879. You do not have permission to embark. Repeat, you do not have permission to embark. Please return at once to your station." "Remember, disable them." Joska's voice was strained. The ship turned, so they were pointing towards the loading pad. "And when you're ready." Reka got off the first shot, taking off the wing of one of the larger gunships. The Yibo shouted through the radio, and Savina could see them fumbling about like ants whose hill had been stepped on. Savina aimed her sights towards another gunship, lining up with the body. Then she cast a sideways glance at Reka and scowled. It was clearly a shot to maximize casualties, so she'd have to play it off as a mistake to Joska. And she wasn't damn well about to admit making a mistake in front of Reka. She shifted her aim to one side, and the entire tail section of the ship exploded. Reka fired on a communications tower, and Savina recalibrated her aim to another gunship. "You're going to have to be faster," said Joska through the radio. "They're getting the ground guns out, it looks like. I'm going to have to go up in a minute." Reka fired again, then once more, and the communications tower went up in a ball of flame. Then there was a roar of sound, and the entire ship shook. Savina was thrown against the straps and gasped out a breathless curse as pain blossomed across her side from her bruises. "Go!" shouted Benny. "If we get hit with another of those, the shields are gone." Joska spun the ship, and there was the unsettling gut punch of acceleration as it shot upwards. Behind them, crews were scrambling for the gunships. "Once we're out of atmosphere, this is going to be a dogfight," said Joska through the radio. Hold on! Then they were through and out into the clean black of space. The Yibo ship must be equipped with artificial gravity because, despite a slight disorientation, Savina didn't feel the now familiar weightlessness of the Dolphin. Other ships were bursting through the atmosphere behind them, and she spun in her seat, lining up her gun sights on the fleeing ships. She shot, and one of them spiraled off, its tail section split open. Savina wasn't certain if that was technically not killing them, but really, there was only so much that could be expected of her once they were in space. Reka was firing steadily, and between the two of them, the ships leaving atmosphere were being shot down almost as they came through. But they couldn't hit everyone. There was no way. There were too many of them, and they were coming through far too quickly, and it was taking more than just one shot to take them out now that their shields were up. And to make matters worse, the survivors were forming up, their combined shields heavy enough that Savina's and Reka's shots could hardly make a dent. "Joska," Savina said through her teeth. "I know," said Joska quietly. "I know." The ship rocked, and from the cockpit, Benny gave a startled yelp. Joska swore. "We're not going to be able to afford many more direct hits." "We're doing the best we can back here," snapped Savina. She was firing as fast as she could aim, and so was Reka, but it wasn't going to be enough. The ship rocked again. "Savina," said Joska quietly through the link, "before you knew we'd taken the ship, you were telling me there was one last thing you could do." Savina turned to glance at Reka. "Yes," said Savina. "Yes, we did." "It looks like we're not going to make it out of this alive," said Joska. "I don't suppose you still have that explosive?" Savina glanced at Reka again. The woman nodded grimly. "Yes," said Savina, "we do." "Good," said Joska. She paused. "Their formation is still tightly packed. If we were to fly in there, and if we timed the explosion right—" She didn't finish the sentence. "That would mean a hell of a lot of casualties," said Savina. She was trying to make her voice mocking, but it wasn't really working. "I know," said Joska, "but I can't sit by and watch the Joias System be destroyed." She paused a moment, then added wryly, "At the very least, I suppose I won't be alive to feel bad about it afterwards." Chapter 30. Alba. A few minutes after Aran and the others disappeared, Istve returned to where Alba waited with Josip and Feliu. Istve seemed more distracted than usual, but when she glanced at them questioningly, they just glared at her. "Let's get out of here," Istve whispered, "as far away as we can. If any of the raiders find us, all bets are off, and we need to be somewhere we can make a distraction for Aran when he needs it." They glanced around quickly, and she could see in their face the sudden realization of what exactly they were working with. An old woman and two old men, Feliu, the youngest of them. Istve didn't say anything, though, just gestured with their chin for the others to follow, and started off through the trees. But they matched their pace to Alba's and didn't try to rush her. It wasn't until the group of them reached a dip between two of the rolling hills, the crest of the hill above them high enough that they could barely see the top of the Yibo facility over the edge of it, that she realized that Istve wasn't only going slowly to let her and the others keep up. They were breathing heavily even with the minor exertion, and their face was pale and drawn. "Listen," they said, "the three of you stay down here. I'll go up and watch for Aran's flare." They paused. "I'll need your help once the flare goes off. I can't create the distraction by myself." "I suggest we make a distraction immediately." Alba's muscles were trembling with strain, and the remembered despair at the thought they'd lost everything still buzzed uncomfortably through her body. "If we can get the guards watching over here—" "No." Istve's voice was flat. "We're going to do this Aran's way." "But—" Alba began. Istve cut her off with the brusque gesture. "We're doing this the way Aran asked." Alba turned to glare at them. "Aran is down there," she said, her voice icy. Her whole body was still shaky from the panic. "We can see what's going on better than he can. I suggest that we find out—" Istve spun on her, and she almost stepped back at the fury in their expression. "I am not going to discuss this any further," Istve said through their teeth. "Do you ever, even once, stop to think about the fact that other people might know better than you how to deal with their own circumstances? And do you ever stop to think that sometimes people misjudge their own situations? That sometimes it's better for someone with a higher vantage point to make the decisions?" She snapped back. Istve looked at her for a long moment, and the expression on their face was odd, anger mixed with something that was almost pity. "No," they said quietly. "I don't, because I trust Aran. Aran knows what he's doing. If he needs help, he'll tell me. That's the only reason we can work together, the way we do. I trust Aran with my life, and he trusts me with his. And so, no, I won't try to make a decision for him." They paused. "I've done that before," they said at last. "Made decisions that I thought were in Aran's best interest, instead of letting him make them himself. And I'm learning just how much I regret that. They broke off and drew in a deep breath. "I almost ruined maybe the most important thing in my life because I did that. And I'm still not sure I can save it, but I'm damn well going to try." They studied her. "And you, Alba, Chief Justice of the Joias System, you've never once trusted someone that much, have you?" Alba was silent. She felt suddenly very, very tired. She couldn't dispute what Istve had said. She'd always carried the burden of the decisions, even when that burden was far too heavy because she'd never been able to trust someone else to make them. She'd never trusted someone else enough to take her own hands off of the controls. She glanced back at Istve. They looked exhausted, sick, and weak, and she could see the bones of their face in sharp relief. Istve didn't have long, but they trusted Aran. Trusted him enough to let him make decisions that could shape both their own fate and the fate of the Joias System. "I suppose you're right," she said at last, quietly. Istve's head jerked up in shock. "We'll do it your way," she said. "We'll wait for Aran's signal." Istve was still staring at her. At last they gave a brusque nod and turned away, but the look in their eyes as they turned had been less enmity than it had been surprise. They'd been expecting a fight, she realized. She realized, too, how close she'd been to giving them one. Weeks ago, she would have simply ignored what Istve had to say completely. She took a deep breath and let it out again slowly. Maybe this alien landscape was teaching her more than just her own capacity for discomfort. Although whether the lessons were valuable or dangerous, she wasn't entirely sure yet. "All right," said Istve. They fumbled in their supplies pouch and withdrew a handful of small metal devices, then handed one each to her, Josip, and Feliu. "When the flare goes off, I have an idea how to make a distraction, but in order for it to work, we're going to need to spread out. These are transmitters, and they're going to..." From the direction of the compound, a bright red glow lit the sky. Istve's head jerked up, and they cursed. "We're out of time," they said tersely. "The transmitters will mess with the raider ship's signals. I don't have time to explain. We've got to do this now. Feliu, I need you 20 meters that way. Josip, over the hill and 20 meters in the other direction. Alba, stay where you are. You'll all need to hold the transmitters over your head. Don't worry about the rest. I'll take care of it. Just stay where I put you." They pulled another small device out of their supplies pouch, activated it, and clipped it to their belt. "I'll come back when I can," they said. Then they started off towards the top of the hill. Alba watched them go, her teeth clenched. This wasn't going to work. Istve was clearly at the end of their strength. They'd never make it far enough to do whatever it was they were planning on doing. Istve reached the top of the hill, staggering a little, shouting and waving their arms. Alba's chest tightened in sudden, unreasoning terror. Istve was bringing the raiders here. Right down in the center of them. She closed her eyes for a moment. It didn't matter. It hardly mattered if they were killed, as long as the portal was taken down. But the portal was still open, and the distraction was their only hope, and Istve was bringing the raiders here. She took a deep breath and forced herself to steady. In the back of her mind, she heard Istve's words. You've never once trusted someone that much, have you? It was true. She didn't trust anyone that much. But she'd seen the way Istve looked at Iran. Whatever else she believed about them, she could trust that Istve would never, ever do something that would hurt Iran. Not if they could help it. That Istve wouldn't lie to Iran. And if Iran needed a distraction to take down the portal, the raiders must have seen them. The ships had turned in their direction. You have to hold up the transmitters, Istve shouted back, and started off down the hill toward the raider ships at a stumbling run. Feliu glanced at Alba. She gave a small, brusque nod. Her heart was pounding. She had no idea what the transmitters were supposed to do, but, well, she was out of her depth now. Trusting Istve was the only option. Josip had already activated his device, and the three of them stood where Istve had showed them, holding the devices up as the raider ships swooped closer. There was a stuttering burst of weapons fire from the other side of the hill, and Alba closed her eyes, trying not to imagine how Istve's body would look if they'd been caught in that. The expression on Iran's face if he came back and found them. There was another burst of weapons fire. Alba's heart was in her throat. The ships appeared over the edge of the hill, almost on top of her and Josip and Feliu. Istve must have miscalculated. Istve must be lying dead, and now she and Josip and Feliu were all going to die as well. She'd trusted them. She'd let Istve and Iran make the decisions they thought would be best, the ones she should have made herself, and the two of them had miscalculated somewhere. There'd be no distraction for Iran, no way to stop the Yibo and the raiders from streaming through the open portal, destroying everything on the other side, everything she knew, everything she loved, everything she'd given her entire life for. Still, she held up the transmitter the way Istve had demonstrated. And then, as suddenly as they'd appeared, the raider ships pulled up short. They spun, all of them, and shot back the way they'd come, towards the Yibo compound at the bottom of the hill. Chapter 31. Iran. Istve would give him a distraction. They'd promised. But until then, Iran was the only distraction any of them had. He made it behind the shelter of one of the smaller outbuildings and dropped to the ground, yanking out his pistol. Ani was hissing on his shoulder, bridling, barely restraining herself. "Easy, girl," he said soothingly. "I'll tell you when, okay?" The Yibo soldiers skidded around the side of the building, saw Ani, and stumbled to a halt, jumping back out of sight. Ani spit on Iran's whispered command, leaving a smoking hole in the floor of the courtyard where the guard had just been. "What the hell?" Iran's AI translated. "Stay back," said Iran, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just stay back." "Human." The voice was deep, with a strong accent and arrogant tone. "Human, whatever it is you're doing, you may as well stop. We found the two down by the machine and we have them trapped. They're going to die, and if you don't want to die as well, you'd best give yourself up." Iran's stomach tightened at the Yibo's words. Ines and Nicolau. They damn well trusted him. Damn it. He hadn't asked for this. He'd never asked for any of this. He took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "Listen," he said, trying to keep his voice from shaking. "If I give myself up, will you keep the other two alive?" From outside, the man spat out a sudden, panicked curse in Yibo. There was the sound of running footsteps. And then, nothing. Iran stared around him in bewilderment. Then something crashed into the force field above him with an impact loud enough to set Iran's ears ringing. There was an explosion. The force field flickered. It died. Iran blinked, not quite believing his eyes, as a raider attack pod tumbled through, followed by 4 others. In the compound, Yibo were running, screaming, diving for cover. A raider ship shot through after the pods, and this one Iran dimly recognized as the ship that had hunted them from the Yibo city. He shook his head to clear it and sprinted back towards the entrance to the underground bunker. One of the ships must have seen him. He leapt out of the way of a blast that scorched a smoking hole in the concrete, then dived into the small building. The door of it exploded behind him. Then he was pounding down the stairs. He ducked through the doorway at the bottom to find the underground room devolved into pure chaos. Yibo shoving and screaming and trying to get out of the way. "Inez! Nicolau!" he shouted. "Are you in here? Aran, what the hell is going—" Nicolau began in a strained voice from where they'd sheltered in a corner, but Aran cut him off. "Inez, did you figure out where we can plant the detonators?" Inez nodded. Behind them, the stairwell exploded. "Then let's get the hell over there!" Aran shouted above the noise. Nicolau and Inez jumped to their feet. Inez beckoned, and Aran and Nicolau followed her through the twisting maze that was the heart of the mechanism. Another explosion rocked the entryway to the bunker. It appeared the raider ship had decided to simply blow its way down the stairs after Aran. "What the hell is going on out there?" panted Nicolau. "Why is there someone—" "Long story," muttered Aran. "Let's just get this damn detonator planted and get the hell out." There was another explosion behind them. "Here," Inez whispered. "If we can take this section down, it should shut down the portal. This connects the mechanism to the energy generator, and it should set off a chain explosion." Aran grabbed a handful of detonators from his pouch and tossed them in a loose pile at the center of the place Inez had indicated. "I'm going to shoot a pulse blast to trigger the detonators and start the reaction," he whispered. "We'll have to run like hell if we want to make it out alive. You two get started. I'll follow." The two of them hesitated, their faces tight with strain. There was another explosion from the raider ship, and the ceiling above their heads creaked with the strain. Aran aimed his pistol at the detonators. "Go!" he gasped, and fired. Then he turned, and the three of them ran, the sharp pop of the detonators sounding behind them. "This way!" Inez panted. "There's an emergency exit!" They reached it, and Nicolau fired a shot from his pulse pistol into the door. The lock exploded, and he shoved it open with bare force. Then the three of them were pounding up the stairway. The shock from the bunker's explosion caught them just as they emerged, picking them up and flinging them across the courtyard. Aran landed hard, gasping, the breath knocked from him, Ani clinging desperately to his shoulders. His leg ached, and there was a sharp, stinging pain in his arm. He looked around frantically for Inez and Nicolau and saw them laying on the concrete a few meters away. Inez was already pushing herself into a sitting position, but Nicolau's eyes were closed, his face pale, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. The raider ship swung around, hovering over them. Then it rocked back with the force of another explosion as a second raider ship appeared. Aran could make out Kravai in the cockpit. He was grinning maniacally, sharp incisors gleaming as the two ships turned their attention to each other. "Let's go!" Aran hissed. Inez pushed to her feet, hurling herself towards Nicolau. Nicky, are you—" Nicolau groaned, his eyes fluttering open. Inez gave a small sob of relief. Aran grabbed Nicolau on one side, pulling the young man's arm over his shoulders, and Inez steadied him on the other side. "Nicky, you're all right, you're—" She went up on her tiptoes and kissed him. Nicolau flushed a deep red, a dazed smile on his face. Aran looked away, fighting back the ache in his chest. "Come back to me, okay?" "Soon." "Come on, we've got to get out of here," he muttered, and supporting a stumbling Nicolau between them, he and Inez ran for the opening the raiders had blasted through the force field. As they slid through the opening, there was a sharp crack of light, bright enough to momentarily turn the night to midday. Aran glanced up on instinct, then shielded his eyes as the light brightened. And then it disappeared. And the portal disappeared with it. Chapter 32. Alba. Alba watched in shock as the raider ships crashed through the force field, fighting like two dogs in the street. The entire compound lit up with explosions as she watched in disbelieving silence. Josip and Feliu had come to join her, and the three of them stared down at the destruction below. "Well," said Feliu at last, "I suppose that should provide a distraction." Alba just nodded, too stunned to speak. There was another explosion, more massive than any of the ones that had come before, and an entire section of the courtyard caved in as Yibo scattered in every direction. The rumbling boom had scarcely died away when the sky above them, where the portal cut a gash through the emptiness of space, lit up, brighter and brighter, until they all had to shield their eyes against the brilliance. It brightened even more, momentarily so brilliant that it burned even through her closed eyelids. And then the light vanished. She opened her eyes, blinking. When her sight had readjusted to the darkness, she looked up in the sky where the portal had been. It was gone. They'd done it. Somehow, they'd done it. Josip was grinning so wide that his smile hardly fit on his face. Even Falyu was smiling, an expression of mixed wonder and happiness, and just a touch of regret. And suddenly, the implications of what they had done finally hit. Alba took a deep breath, closing her eyes. She wasn't sure exactly what she was feeling, happiness or horror. She'd done it. She'd done what she set out to do, saved the Joias System. And now the portal was closed, and hundreds of humans trapped here, forever. From everything she'd seen, they were doomed to an existence of slavery or outright death. And she'd been the one responsible. "You've never once trusted someone that much, have you?" Istvay had asked. In the end, though, she had trusted them and Aran. She'd trusted them to take down the portal. But as for the decision to take the portal down in the first place, she'd made that decision herself. And she'd have to live with that, for however long the remainder of her life would be. There was a noise behind her, and she spun in time to see Istvay. Their face was pale and damp with sweat, their expression one of grim determination, and they moved slowly, as if every step was an effort, but they were grinning. "I told you Aran knew what he was doing," they said, coming up to stand with the three of them. Their voice was ragged with exhaustion. Alba turned to them, frowning. "Istvay," she said, "are you—" She wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. She'd known plenty of people who died from the defect. You could hardly avoid that, growing up in the Joias System. But most of the people she'd known had died years ago. No one with the defect survived much past 30, and she was well into her 70s. Even when she'd been in her 30s, she hadn't known what to say to someone dying of it. What did you say to someone whose body was slowly killing them? Istvay managed a small smile. "I'll be all right," they said. "Anyways, until Aran and I find something, there's nothing I can do about it." Alba nodded stiffly and turned back to watch the chaos below them. There was a sound from above, and she looked up, startled, to see 3 large Yibo ships approaching. She tensed. "If they're here to—" she began. Istvay had tensed as well, but they shook their head. "If they're here to fix the portal, they won't be able to, at least not easily. Aran knows what he's doing." Alba nodded. "I suppose if that's the case, we can hardly complain if we lose our lives to Kachik's people rather than the raiders. At least the Yibo shouldn't eat us." Istvay looked at her in surprise, then gave a small snort of laughter. Josip chuckled as well. Falyu looked scandalized. "Madam?" he began. Then the first of the Yibo appeared over the top of the hill. Alba could tell at once that these Yibo were military. Something about their posture and their uniform was somehow universal. The Yibo stopped on seeing them, appearing taken aback. More came over the hill, and the Yibo, who appeared to be the commanding officer, snapped at them. "What are you—" She trailed off, staring down at the humans. Then she shook her head. Humans. There was a note in her voice Alba couldn't interpret. "Well, it looks like we found the cause of this." The captain paused a moment. "Go get Jair," she called over her shoulder. One of the Yibo soldiers jogged off in the direction she indicated, and the captain gestured her people to stay back. At last, the Yibo soldier returned, with a tall figure in tow. Alba frowned, and then her heartbeat sped up. The figure wasn't Yibo, it wasn't a raider either, it was a human, one who was completely unfamiliar. "Hello?" said the man, stepping forward. His face was weathered and weary-looking, and his accent one she hadn't heard before. "What are you doing here?" The explanations took some time. Jair, as he introduced himself, was, it appeared, originally from the Labyrinto system. He refused to elaborate, though, when Alba asked, just said in a quiet tone, "If you're caught by Kachik and his people, you'll be killed. Iera is offering you asylum. It's the same offer she's made to any humans who have come through the portal." Alba stared at him in confusion. "Asylum?" Jair nodded grimly. We saw the portal open, but Era wasn't ready to start an outright war with Kashyyyk over it. A human system wasn't exactly worth a civil war. He shrugged dryly. She planned to come down here and see if she could talk Kashyyyk into peace, and then the portal opened again. We came as fast as we could, but... He shrugged again. It seems you've taken care of the problem yourselves. He paused a moment, then leaned in closer. She saw the tension in his face. Thank the holy mystery you did, he said quietly. If you have anyone you love back in that system, thank the holy mystery that you managed to shut the portal down. Alba watched him for a long moment, her heart pounding. They're offering us asylum? She asked at last. As a fellow human, would you advise us to take it? The man nodded without hesitation. If Kashyyyk gets his hands on you, you're as good as dead. This is your only safe option. He paused. And if you come, you may be in a position to do some good. The government is debating how to handle the human issue, including any refugees who may have arrived through the portal. Having someone here from your system would be helpful. Alba watched him. At last, she said quietly, I'll need to talk with the others before I can make a decision. Jair nodded and stepped back. Alba walked slowly back to where the others were waiting and gave them a brief summary of the conversation. She could sense Istvay's tension as she spoke, see the frown of concern growing on Filiu's face. I don't know that we have much of a choice, said Josip quietly when she'd finished. And, he paused, and, Alba, this may be our chance to do something, at least, for the others we've stranded here. I think we have a responsibility to do that. Slowly, Alba nodded. Istvay? She asked at last. Istvay shook their head. You go on. I'm going back to camp to wait for Aran. I told him I'd meet him there, and I don't want him to come and not find me. He'll worry. Besides, we promised to go back with the raiders, and Aran's not going to change his mind about that. He's far too stubborn. They paused a moment. If you see him, tell him I'm waiting. Their voice was quiet, and there was something soft and fond and sharp with longing in their tone. Alba nodded, and Istvay turned back to the camp, walking slowly. Jair watched them go, concern on his face. Alba turned to him. We accept your offer of asylum, she said briskly. Istvay, however, and their friend, had some unfinished business with the raiders they needed to take care of. And we're waiting for a few others. I can't speak for them, but I assume they'll want to come with us as well. Jair nodded and sighed. All right, I'll let the captain know, and we'll prepare quarters for you in the ships. In the meantime, we were planning on taking over the facility to stop Kashyyyk from rebuilding, but... He glanced down at the smoking destruction below them. It appears that will not be necessary. I very much doubt it would be, Alba murmured. She watched Jair leave, saying something to the Yibo captain as he passed. The woman nodded brusquely and barked a command, and a handful of soldiers started back to the ship at a smart march. Well, what do you think? Asked Josip. Do we have a chance? Of course we do. Alba turned to look at Filiu in surprise. He was looking at Josip. I'm not sure what you think of Alba, he continued, in his usual curt tones, but I think you've been around long enough to know that she won't give up, not as long as there's a chance to save lives. He paused. People have asked me, before, why I've served as her clerk for so long. I could have gone on to do other things, I suppose, but... He turned, catching Alba's eyes for just a moment. But of all the politicians I've worked with, the Chief Justice is one who actually tries to do the right thing. She doesn't prevaricate, and she doesn't compromise her morals, whatever the personal or political cost. And I have always been proud to work with her. Alba stared, her mind gone completely blank. Josip smiled, that warm, friendly smile he had. Yes, he said quietly. I've noticed the same thing. He turned to Alba. Very well, Alba, he said. I suppose we'd best go see if it's still possible to save our friends back in Kashyyyk City. Alba blinked rapidly for a moment, and she had to clear her throat before she could speak. I suppose we'd better, she said. The three of them started after Jair towards the Yibo ship. Chapter 33. Savina. Savina watched the packed ship formation, the open portal black and threatening behind them. There was a sick feeling in her stomach. They'd failed. Nicolau had failed, and she couldn't stop and think, right now, what that probably meant. Because she was going to die too in just a few minutes. The defensive formation had turned, focused now on sheltering the ships headed for the portal, rather than attacking Joska's ship. And, as they'd all learned after the breakup of the diplomatic ship, the portal was much closer to the Yibo planet than it had been from Colorida. Even the injured escape pods from the diplomatic ship had been able to make the planet in less than 24 hours. And these Yibo ships were much, much faster than the escape pods. "I'll hold them with the guns," said Savina, glancing at Reka. "You plant the explosive." Reka nodded without speaking and slipped down from the gunner's seat. She pulled out the explosive from the pocket of her suit and activated her wavelink. "I can give us up to 5 minutes once I set the explosive. How long will you need to get us into the middle of them, Joska?" Savina felt something tighten in her throat. Before, it had only been her who was going to die. Well, her and Reka, but then it had seemed fitting, somehow, that the two of them would die together. But now it was Benny, Rafael, Joska. Savina would have never imagined worrying about someone like Joska, someone whose ship she'd hijack, someone who insisted on treating her like a rebellious teenager, someone who constantly got in the way of her plans, someone who, against all odds and against all common sense, actually cared about Savina, someone who, when Savina was lying on the floor in the basement of the Yibo government building, wondering if she was about to be beaten to death, was the person she'd thought of, the person she'd wished, sharply and irrationally, could be there. Not to save her, just so that there'd be someone who'd care when she died. She took a deep breath, turning back to the guns. "I guess you don't care about me killing them now, since we're about to send all of them to the damn void," she said through her wavelink, trying to make her tone snarky. "Not care might be a stretch," came Joska's familiar dry voice, "but realize the necessity?" Reluctantly, yes. "Realize I'm right about killing, you mean?" said Savina, in an attempt at humor. Joska snorted. "May the mystery strike me down if that ever happens." "I don't think you'll have to wait for the mystery to strike you down from the looks of things," said Savina. She lined up a shot and sent it off, and a Yibo ship disintegrated. "I'm in the fuel storage room," came Reka's brisk, emotionless voice. "Let me know when you want me to set it." "Give me a minute," Joska muttered. The ship shook as another shot hit them, and Benny made a small sound of distress. Savina closed her eyes. She was supposed to keep Benny safe, and Benny was going to die here, without even Savina there, holding their hand. "All right," said Joska. "As soon as I get—" She broke off with a choked curse. Savina whirled, staring out the gunner's viewport. The portal overhead was spitting and crackling like a grease fire with water tossed onto it. "What in the hell?" Rafael began, in a strained voice. The portal cracked and snapped again, glowing whip-cracks of energy flying off it and hurtling into space. "Someone gets hit with one of those, they won't be around long enough to complain about it," said Joska, her tone odd. "Vina! Vina! What's happening?" Benny's voice through Savina's wavelink was frantic. "It's all right, Benny," said Savina, her voice oddly soft. I think... "The portal's closing," Rafael broke in gruffly. "The Chief Justice or that scientist or someone must have figured something out. The portal's closing." The Yibo ships had obviously realized the same thing they had. The ones closest to the portal had turned tail and were fleeing at top speed. As Savina watched, another bolt of energy cracked out, hitting one of the ships. It disintegrated, and Savina was hit with an awful, horrifying flashback to the sight of the diplomatic ship exploding as the Dolphin fled for its life. And then, in a shuddering burst of light so bright that the after images were seared across Savina's eyelids, the portal was gone. For a long time, there was stunned silence across the ship. At last, Joska said in an awed voice, "Well," she fell silent, as if unsure how to continue. Is it closed? Benny's voice was quiet. It's closed, for good or for ill, said Joska, and we're trapped here, but Joias is safe. Slowly, Savina became aware of the background noise, the frantic chatter through the radio as Yibo ships raced to try to pull survivors from the broken hulls of the ships that had been too close. Once, Savina might have suggested shooting down as many as they could while the Yibo were distracted. But the horror of the diplomatic ship's breakup weeks ago, the thousands of lives lost to the void of space, was still playing in her memory, and she couldn't seem to make herself bring it up. Joska would never have agreed anyway. We won't be any help with survivors, said Joska at last. They'll think we're going in to attack, so I think the best we can do is leave them to salvage what they can. Her voice was quiet and grave. They came back down through the atmosphere, and Joska piloted them to the tiny clearing where they'd landed the Dolphin weeks earlier. The ship was there now, battered and worn, but familiar, waiting for them. They left the damaged Yibo ship where it was and gathered in the cockpit of the Dolphin. So, said Joska when they were all together. She looked beyond tired, worn and exhausted, strain lines written across her weathered face. Savina waited for her to continue, but she seemed not to know what to say next. What do we do now? Asked Benny. Joska turned to them and tried to smile. I suppose that's the question we should all be asking. The portal's gone, and if things turned out as planned, the mechanism is completely destroyed. So we're here for the foreseeable future. Likely the rest of our lives, however long that ends up being, because as far as I can tell, she added wryly, we are not on the Yibo's best friend list. Savina gave a half-hearted snort, and Joska smiled. While we were back on the agricultural planet, we found out some more about the politics of this place, Joska continued at last. Apparently, the Yibo in this city aren't the actual legal government. They're some sort of rebel offshoot. I don't know what that means for us, but I suppose it's possible there's at least a chance at diplomacy left for those of us trapped here. I expect that's Alba's intention. However, Savina, she knows who you are, and I know how you feel about that. So, what are your thoughts? There were a long few moments of silence. At last, Reka spoke up. Joska, you seem like a good person and an honest one, and I'm well aware that you saved my life just now, and so I'm going to be honest with you as well. You know who this is. She gestured at Savina. I have also worked with Savina. I know how easy it is for her to subvert your expectations, but... She paused, an odd reluctance in her tone. Regardless of your or my personal feelings on the matter, I was charged with a warrant to bring her to Alba. Perhaps Savina is not exactly what I'd been led to expect. But she's dangerous, and it's my duty, as well as yours, to ensure that she's somewhere she can't cause harm. Savina's heart had begun to pound, a sick feeling welling in her stomach. Don't you touch my sister! Benny's voice was quiet and frightened, but there was a determination to it. You're not hurting Savina. Reka ignored them, her gaze fixed on Joska. Let me take her in. At the very least, let me lock her up. I have some business to take care of, but the moment it's done, I promise you I'll take her back to Alba. Alba can decide what's to be done with her. Savina and I work together, and I appreciate what she's done, but I have a duty, and that duty is no less now that we're trapped behind the portal. Allowing her to go free here, where our very survival as a species is in question, is far too dangerous, both for us and for all the humans trapped here. Joska was simply watching, her face impassive. Savina's heart beat painfully in her chest. If Joska tried to grab her, Savina could shoot her and slip out of the ship in the confusion, or slit the woman's throat with one of her knives. Joska wouldn't be expecting it, and she wasn't wearing armor. She probably couldn't afford it if she wanted it, honestly. But even as Savina thought it, she knew she was fooling herself. She couldn't kill Joska, and she knew perfectly well how Joska felt about what she'd done in the past. I won't kill her, Reka was saying in a level tone, not unless she gives me no other choice. If nothing else, For your sake, Captain, and in repayment for your cooperation, I'll keep her alive. It wasn't true, though, because Savina knew very well what it would mean, being taken captive and brought before Alba. She'd die anyway, so just as well to die in an attempt to escape. There wasn't anything to lose. And if she tried to get away, Reka wouldn't hesitate. She'd seen enough of the woman to know that. Joska was still watching Reka in that evaluating way she had. Finally, she stepped forward, toward Savina. Savina flinched back, her hand on the hilt of her knife. But Joska stepped past her, standing between her and Reka. I can understand why you feel the way you do, Reka, she said, but I'm going to say this once, and I hope it sinks in. If you want to take Savina, you'll do it across my dead body. Rafael sighed reluctantly and shoved himself up out of his chair. I suppose you have to do it over mine too, he grumbled, limping over. Because you're not touching the captain, not while I'm alive to stop it. He shot a glance at Savina, and under his irritable expression, she caught the faintest hint of something that might have been a smile. Besides, this little murdering thief has saved my life twice now. I can't let her die with the ledger that unbalanced. Savina blinked. Her heart was still pounding in uneven rhythm, and her head felt strange and dizzy. Benny stepped up beside her, slipping their hand into hers like they used to do when the two of them were children. Savina glanced over at them and found her eyes were blurred with tears. Reka raised her eyebrows in mild surprise, watching them. Her gaze caught Savina's just for a moment, and Savina looked quickly away. At last, Reka sighed and shook her head. Well, it looks like I can't persuade you otherwise, and after you saved my life, I can't exactly shoot my way through you to get her. She paused a moment. I'll ask that you let me off here, then. As I said, I have business to take care of, back in Char that's rather urgent. She turned. Her gray-green eyes found Savina's, and for a moment it could have been only the two of them in the room. I'll give you a day's start, Savina. I owe you that, I think, she said quietly. And then I'll come for you. Joska nodded slowly. Since I doubt I could keep you here if I wanted to, Reka, she said, you're free to go. Reka gave her a small nod. Thank you for what you did back there, she said. We would have died without you, as would most of the Joias System, I suspect. She glanced at Savina. Savina, she said quietly, until we meet. Then she turned, and without so much as a backward glance, strode down the loading ramp and out into the jungle. Savina watched after her for a long, long time. Finally, Joska shook her head. Well, I suppose at this point, none of us would know what to do if we weren't being chased by Reka Solaire. She turned to Rafael. Do you have that map the Chief Justice gave us? We'll need to find a place to refuel and resupply, and we can make our plans after that. I'm not sure the Yibo even use the same fuel we do, but perhaps we can find something we can make work anyway. Benny, can you give him a hand, please? Rafael nodded and turned back to the co-pilot seat. Benny paused a moment, then squeezed Savina's hand. I won't let Reka take you, Vina, they whispered. She'll have to kill all of us if she wants to get to you, I promise. Then they slipped their hand from hers and followed Rafael into the cockpit. Joska paused, her eyes lingering on Savina. There was a quiet sympathy in her expression that Savina realized she'd come to expect, a kindness beneath her stern gaze. Savina? Joska asked. Are you all right? Savina swallowed hard. She started. Then, to her horror, she felt the tears that had been welling in her eyes spill down her cheeks, and she couldn't speak for the thickness in her throat. She turned away, tears burning tracks down her face, choking back thick sobs. She felt a rough hand on her shoulder, and she fought back the urge to shake it off. Savina. Joska's voice was gentle. Savina, you're safe. It's all right. We weren't ever going to leave you. And then, despite her best efforts, Savina was sobbing, her shoulders shaking, her eyes blurry with tears. Joska rubbed her hand back and forth along Savina's shoulder blades as if she was calming a skittish horse. Come on, Savina, she murmured. You've been through a lot in the last few days, I imagine. Let's get you to the med bay. We'll take a look at your injuries as soon as we're away from here and somewhere a little safer. Savina let Joska take her arm and lead her down the Dolphin's familiar corridors to the med bay. She swallowed the painkiller Joska gave her, then lay back on one of the cots at Joska's prompting and stared numbly up at the ceiling as Joska left to talk to Rafael. The Dolphin lifted gently, and once it had started off, Joska reappeared. Wordlessly, she handed Savina a tissue to wipe her face, then checked her over with quick, competent hands. She sucked in a sharp breath once or twice as her fingers brushed over the worst of the injuries. When she'd finished her examination, she gave Savina a wry look. It's a good thing we came when we did. For all that Rekka's a government agent, she certainly didn't take much care treating that wound on your leg. Savina sniffled. Well, she said, her voice still thick. We both thought we were going to die in 5 minutes' time, so there probably wouldn't have been time for it to get infected. Joska chuckled, a soft, comfortable sound. One day, when you're rested up, you'll have to tell me exactly what happened back there, she said. From the sounds of it, there was plenty of excitement to go around. Although, after knowing you this long, I'm not sure I'd expect anything different. Savina managed a wan smile. This from the woman who hijacked a Yibo ship. Joska's smile in return was genuine. It wasn't nearly as exciting as all that. By the time we got to the loading pad, Matten and his soldiers were in the process of embarking, so no one was too concerned at the sight of a few humans. We found a place to lay low, and when we saw the Yibo bring Rekka on board one of the ships, we assumed you'd follow shortly. We managed to get aboard without drawing attention, and since the pilot wasn't expecting us, it was hardly a fight. Now. She looked Savina over quickly. You lie down. We should be at the Yibo settlement in a couple of hours to pick up supplies. Then we'll head off planet. How are you feeling? I think I just need some sleep, Savina said, swallowing. I'll go into the room off the sick bay and lock the door. Don't wake me up when we get there. I think I'll feel better once I get some rest. Joska studied her for a moment, then, at last, she nodded. All right, Savina, she said quietly. Then she turned and left. Savina stayed on the medbay cot for a few minutes longer. Her injuries still hurt, but the pain had faded a little. She couldn't remember the last time someone had taken care of her like this, not since she was a child in the compound. It had been her mother back then. Her mother's hands smoothing her forehead, soothing a cut, rubbing a bruise. The same hands that had lowered her baby brother, his tiny face screwed up in pain and fear, as he wailed his weak newborn cries into a shallow grave and turned away, tears running down her face, as dirt was thrown over his small, fragile body. She'd cried. She'd stood there crying and done nothing to stop it, and from that day on, those gentle hands had never felt quite the same. Savina had felt the death in them. She took a deep breath, watching the door where Joska had disappeared. She hadn't expected Joska to stand up for her. She wasn't sure what she'd expected exactly, but not that. Joska had somehow managed to talk Nicola into staying back with the others. She'd kept Benny safe. She'd come back for Savina, even though Savina would never have asked. If Savina could trust anyone with her siblings' lives, it was Joska, and after what she'd seen over the past few weeks, if there was one person who was even more dangerous than the Yibo, it was Rekka Solar. She remembered, far too well, the sight of the blood from Rekka's weapon staining Joska's collar. Rekka wouldn't hurt Joska or the others on purpose, but accidents were far, far too easy. At last, Savina slid off the medbay cot and made her way into the small cabin off the medbay, closing the door behind her. She waited until the Dolphin came to a gentle halt and the engine shut down. She could hear voices outside, then the hiss of the loading ramp. When at last it was silent, Savina sat up. She pulled out the sheet of writing paper she'd been creasing between her fingers and straightened it out, pinning it to the bedsheets. She glanced at it one last time, her eyes scanning the words. Joska, I've spent enough time around Rekka to know we'll never be safe with her after me. She'll be a danger to you and to Benny and Nicolau and Rafael, no matter what we do. I know Benny and Nicolau will want you to come after me. Don't. This is the only way I know to keep them safe. And Rafael, too, since he's probably too stupid to do it himself. My wavelength will be turned off, and you won't be able to contact me, so you'd never find me anyway. Get them somewhere safe. Get them to Alba. And if you ever get the chance, get them home. They'd like that, despite what my stupid baby brother says. He's just as stupid and self-sacrificing as you are, and thank you. It wasn't enough, really, but then there probably wasn't anything she could write that would tell Joska what it meant to her, that there was someone watching over Benny and Nicolau, that there was someone who'd put themselves between Savina and someone who wanted to kill her, not as a joke or a decoy, but simply because she wasn't willing to stand by while Savina was hurt. But maybe Joska would understand anyway. Joska had always been far too good at understanding what Savina wasn't willing to say. She smiled to herself just a little, then stood, gathering her things. She was still limping, and the sight of the blood on the bandage around her leg made her feel mildly woozy, but it was nothing she couldn't handle. She opened the door carefully and glanced around. The ship was empty. She limped back to the supplies room and took enough to last her for a week or so, shoving it into a knapsack. Then, quietly, she slipped out the door. The Dolphin had put down close to the outskirts of the small town, and Savina walked down the well-trodden path from the jungle. She saw no sign of the others, and so she made her way towards the market section of town. As she slipped through the stalls, she heard a familiar voice. She peeked through between two buildings. Joska, Raffle, and Benny stood around a stall. Joska was pointing to something and saying in her wry tone, "Listen, I might not be from around here, but that's 3 times the price it was in the city. Don't try to take us for a ride." Savina smiled to herself and ducked back. She looked around her at the Ebo hurrying about their business, her smile widening. It shouldn't be hard to find a ride back to the city. This close, the Ebo must travel back and forth frequently. And who could resist a helpless, sweet, innocent human like her? Especially one with the knife and no compunction about using it. She widened her eyes, pasted on her most innocent, close-lipped smile, and started towards the transportation hub in the center of town. She'd always known it would come to this, eventually, as much as she'd tried to avoid the thought. As long as Reka was alive, no one Savina loved would be safe. The people Savina loved were stupid and naive and ridiculous, and they'd proved it over and over. Stupid enough to risk their own lives for Savina's, even when they shouldn't. Even when she didn't deserve it and didn't ask for it and didn't want it. And she couldn't stop them, but neither could she let them do it, and so Reka would have to die. Resolutely, she shoved back the sick feeling the thought carried with it. Then she switched off her wavelength and started towards a likely-looking ship. Chapter 34. Aran. For a long time, Aran, Nicolau, and Inez simply stared at the space where the portal had been. The relief washing over Aran was so thick it was dizzying, and he almost had to reach out to support himself against a tree. Did we actually? Inez's voice was soft with wonder. "Yes," he said, his voice choking. "I think we did, and from the looks of it..." He glanced over his shoulder at the steaming ruins of the compound, where the raider ships were still dogfighting under the half-formed force field. It might take a while for them to put that back together. Nicolau was grinning like a small boy opening presents on his Saint's Day. He turned to Inez, pulling his arm off Aran's shoulder. "Inez, you were brilliant." He swayed, but Inez caught him. He pulled her into his arms, and then the two of them were kissing, a long, passionate kiss. Aran looked away awkwardly. After a few moments, he cleared his throat. Listen, I don't mean to, but maybe we should get farther away before we..." Reluctantly, Nicolau pulled back. His expression was dazed and softer than Aran had ever seen it. Inez's eyes were sparkling, her entire face lit up. "Yeah," she gasped, a little breathlessly. "Yes, that's probably a good idea." Aran grinned despite himself, and the 3 of them started back the way they'd come. By the time they reached the top of the hill, Aran could see what had caused the disruption back in the facility. At least a dozen Yibo military ships had landed in a semicircle around the hill beyond their encampment. They were at a respectful distance from the raider ships, but they were heavily armed enough that they probably didn't have much to be afraid of. From the look of the Yibo soldiers, though, and the way that the military captains were gesturing and barking orders, it didn't look like the raiders were their main target. Aran frowned. "Who the hell—" he began. Nicolau glanced over at him. His eyes were still a bit starry, and he was grinning like a kid. "Oh, you didn't hear, did you? I guess the Yibo we met in the city when we first got to this system are actually not the government. They're—" He shrugged. "Some rebel group. Anyway, I'm guessing these are the actual military." Aran stared at him, but it was clear he wasn't going to get any better explanation from the young man at the moment. "Humans?" Aran jerked his head up, in time to see. He frowned. It was a human he didn't recognize. His accent was strange, nothing like anything Aran had heard back in Colorida. But the words themselves were understandable enough, the common dialect they still used for scientific research. "Excuse me, are you traveling with Alba?" Aran gave a wary nod. The human smiled, his drawn face relaxing a bit. "Good. You're safe then." He strode forward and clapped a hand on Nicolau's shoulder. When he tried to do the same with Aran, Ani hissed, and Aran stepped back quickly. "I'm sorry," he began. She's a little—" The man gave Ani a wary glance, then shrugged. "The group of you have done an immense service. We didn't have the precise location of the portal mechanism, or the ability to take it out without starting a full-on war. But you've taken it out yourself, it appears, and Kachik's people have been thrown into enough disarray that I think we'll be able to take this place without bloodshed. Now, if you head back to the ship, the others are waiting for you." He turned, and cautiously, Aran, Inez, and Nicolau followed him back towards the military ships. Alba stood beside the loading ramp of one of the ships, in conversation with a Yibo soldier. She turned when she saw them, and her face went slack with relief. "I'm glad to see you made it," she said in her sharp tone. "After that explosion, I wasn't sure." She paused. "These Yibo have offered us asylum, and I think it's best we take it. The choice, however, is up to each of you." "Where's Istvay?" Aran interrupted, his pulse pounding in his ears as he scanned the small group. "Where the hell is Istvay? Did something— Are they—" "It's all right," said Josip, stepping forward. "Istvay's in the camp. They said they'd wait for you there. They weren't sure where you'd come first, and they didn't want you to worry." "They're all right?" asked Aran, his voice sharp. "They didn't. I mean, nothing." Josip gave him a small smile. "They're tired. They had to run a bit to get the raiders to follow them, and I don't think they'll want to do that again anytime soon, but—" The smile wrinkles in the corners of his eyes deepened. "They're all right." Aran closed his eyes, the tension in his shoulders releasing for the first time since he'd left Istvay here with the others. "I won't be coming back with you," he said, turning back to Alba. "Istvay and I promised the raiders we'd go back, and—" He shrugged helplessly. "This is the best chance I have of finding that cure, but when we find it, we'll try to make our way to you." Josip's eyes were twinkling. "Thank you, Aran, for everything." He lifted a hand, giving Aran a questioning look. Aran nodded, and Josip put his hand on Aran's shoulder. "Good luck," the old man said with that kind, friendly smile. "To both of you." Aran nodded, then took a deep breath and turned away. Istvay was waiting for him. He made his way back to the camp, ignoring the bustle around him. His heart was beating faster again, and he found his hands were shaking. Ani gave a questioning chirrup, and he smiled, leaning his head against the bulk of her on his shoulder. "It's all right, Ani," he said, his words coming out strange. "It's just, I think, maybe—" He couldn't finish. Ani didn't seem to mind, though, just purred and clamped herself tighter against his shoulder. When he reached the tent, Aran paused, closing his eyes for just a moment. His heart was pounding almost as fast as it had been back in the Yibo compound. Istvay had kissed him. And with that kiss, Every wall that Aran had spent the last however many years of his life building up had crumbled into dust. He loved them, and maybe, just maybe, somehow, he couldn't let himself think farther than that because his heart was beating too fast already, and he felt lightheaded and a little dizzy. He took a deep breath, then pushed the tent flap aside and ducked inside. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust to the darkness. Istve's supplies pouch and their knapsack lay in a heap, their jacket tossed over it in the unconscious, comfortable way they had when they were resting after a long day. And then he frowned. Istve wasn't there. He crossed over to the back of the tent in 2 quick steps. He could still see the place where Istve must have sat, and beside it, a long, sharp gash cut through the tent wall. He stared at it, feeling like someone had hit him in the stomach. This couldn't be happening. Not now, not after everything. Maybe he'd misinterpreted the signs. Maybe Istve had stepped outside. Maybe they were playing a joke on him, or they'd gone for a drink of water, or something. He ducked through the slit opening, looking around desperately. His lungs were having a hard time pulling in air, his hands shaking. There, on the ground outside, where the tent had been slit open, there'd been some sort of scuffle. He dropped to one knee slowly, dazedly. His fingers ran along the ground in a practiced motion until they touched something wet. He swallowed hard. His heart beat, a sharp pain in his chest. He rubbed the wet dirt between his fingers, then brought it to his nose. He could smell the sharp, iron tang of it even before he touched it to his tongue. He spat out the bitter metallic taste and had to fight to keep from throwing up. Blood. Istve had been here, and then something had cut through the tent, and there was a shape where a body had fallen, a human-sized body, and blood on the ground. Blood smeared in the place where the head would have landed, and around it. He forced himself to open his eyes, despite the screaming panic in his brain, forced himself to look. Footsteps. Raider footsteps. And then he couldn't hold it anymore, and he leaned over and vomited again and again until his stomach was empty, his whole body shaking. It was impossible. This couldn't have happened. It had to be a dream. He had to wake up. He had to stop this. Istve couldn't be gone. Ani was making plaintive sounds of distress, her tentacles tightening around his arms and brushing across his face. But he couldn't spare attention even for her. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. Aran, they said we might find you here. You and I have some things to talk about, I think. He didn't even look up at the dangerous tone in Kravai's voice, just sat where he was, curled into a ball, shaking. Aran? Dimly, he recognized Desi's voice, heard her footsteps as she crossed over and crouched beside him. Aran, are you injured? We came here to find you and your Ani and your Istve. Where's... She trailed off. Then she jumped to her feet with a curse and strode off. Aran stayed where he was, trying to remind his lungs to breathe, trying to remind himself why it even mattered. A moment later, he heard Kravai behind him, cursing loudly and creatively. Damn her, he snarled. You're sure she's the one who took our Aran's Istve? Come look, said Desi. This wasn't one of ours. The raider's footsteps crossed over to the tent, next to where Aran was sitting. Aran didn't even look up. That's her, said Kravai at last, his voice gruff. She must have been watching for a time when they were alone. He swore again. It's just like her. Take one of my humans just to spite me. And then she'll think she can flaunt them around, like her prize of war. Aran wasn't listening, but something in the captain's words seeped through the dull emptiness in his brain. He jerked his head up sharply. Flaunt them around? His voice was tight. You mean she wouldn't have just killed them? Kravai turned to Aran, frowning. No, I doubt she'd do that. She would have, before you were part of my crew, but if she knows the human's mind, she won't kill it right away. I can't promise you she won't eat it sooner or later, but generally speaking, if you capture an enemy's crew, you give it 3 or 4 days before you kill them. Give the other ship a chance to try to get them back. It's a show of strength, and she'll need that now that the portal is gone. Aran closed his eyes, sucking in a quick breath. Something cold was hardening in the pit of his stomach. He rose to his feet, grabbing Istvay's knapsack and slinging it over his back. He strapped Istvay's supply pouch beside his and turned grimly back in the direction that he and Istvay had left the stolen attack pod. "Aran! Where are you going?" Desi called. Aran turned to face her. He felt completely calm, completely cold, and for the first time in his life, even the aching, unmistakable terror at the thought of what he was going to do couldn't penetrate the deathly calm. "I'm going to find Istvay, and I'm going to bring them back." Chapter 35. Epilogue. The first thing Istvay was aware of was the sharp pounding behind their eyes. For a moment, they lay perfectly still, trying to remember what the hell had happened. And then they remembered and choked out a mumbled curse. They'd been waiting in the tent, eyes closed, fighting back the exhaustion of their long run to attract the raiders' attention. Get them to start towards the hill where the transmitters Alba and Josip and Felju were holding would bounce the signals back from the facility. They'd pretended to be all right when Alba asked, but they hadn't been really. They'd been so tired, almost too weary to put one foot in front of the other. But it hadn't mattered, because they were waiting for Aran. They were waiting for him to come back, like he'd promised he would. And Aran wouldn't ever break his promise, not a promise he'd made to Istvay. He'd walk through hell and the void, and not even notice. Istvay had always known that. And then Istvay groaned. The raider captain. The knife slipped through the fabric tent walls. How Istvay had scrambled to their feet. Too late, the hands grabbing at them, being dragged outside, shouts muffled, the blow to their head. Cautiously, they blinked their eyes open. They were in a small, enclosed space. Their hands were bound behind their back, their feet tied together. Blood crusted across the side of their face and down over their lips and chin, and Istvay grimaced, trying to brush it away on their shoulder. The movement sent a wave of pain through their head, and they had to close their eyes for a moment, waiting for it to subside. There was something sick and heavy sitting in their stomach. Aran would come back. Istvay had no doubt of that. Aran would come looking for them. And he'd find them gone. He'd find the marks in the ground, see the blood. And then he would... Istvay squeezed their eyes shut, fighting back panic. They'd seen the look on Aran's face back when the two of them were children together, and Istvay's mother had died. They'd seen what it had done to Aran. And seeing that blank hopelessness in his eyes had been worse than anything, worse than Istvay's own sadness, worse than their own despair. They couldn't bear the thought of those bright, gentle eyes, that sensitive, sweet face, gone blank and empty and hopeless ever again. They couldn't. Even as a 10-year-old, it had almost broken Istvay, seeing Aran in pain and not being able to do anything to fix it. And now... They took a deep breath. They were still alive. There was that, at least. The door creaked open, and the raider captain stepped inside. She looked Istvay over with a wide smile. The scar from a pulse pistol rippled across her face, angry and red, and there was vicious satisfaction in her expression. "So," she said, crouching down in front of Istvay, her hands on her knees, "the human is awake." She smiled, showing her teeth, but there was sharp hatred in that smile. "Krevai added you to his crew, did he? Good. That only makes this more satisfying." She reached down, pulling a long butchering knife from her belt. "At first, I wanted to kill you out of revenge for this." She gestured to the bright scar across her face. "That would have been enough. And then you took down the portal, which is going to cause more bloodshed. The other raider crews were looking to me to lead us through it. And now I learn that Krevai took you and the other human on as part of his crew." She brought the knife up, the sharp blade of it pressing against Istvay's throat. Istvay forced themselves to keep their eyes on her face, instead of glancing down at the blade. Their heart was beating fast and uneven. "Krevai may act stupid, but he's canny. He wouldn't have got where he was if he hadn't been. So there's a reason he took you." She paused. "I suspect the reason had more to do with your friend and his... whatever the hell that thing is." She shuddered, and Istve bit back a grim smile. But I don't know that for certain. Either way, the two of you seemed close, and if I know anything about humans, I'm sure losing you will break the other one. So, either way, I win. She drew the knife gently down Istve's throat and across their shoulder. Istve grimaced at the sharp flare of pain that followed the blade, the hot wet of blood dripping down after it, soaking through their filthy shirt. Tradition says I keep you alive for 3 days, since you're part of Krivai's crew. But this is too important. I'm facing challenges to my leadership, and I can't afford to be fighting Krivai in the meantime. Besides, she raised an eyebrow suggestively. It's been a long time since I've tasted human flesh. I miss it. She straightened, looking them over appraisingly, and drew back the knife. Istve gritted their teeth. They couldn't die, not now, not like this. Not with Iran waiting for them back in the camp. Not with everything they'd left unsaid. Wait, they snapped. The captain paused. Yes, she said, her tone amused. Are you going to beg for your life? That could be entertaining. Wait, said Istve again. Their breath was coming quick and unsteady. I'm more useful than you think. Her smile widened. Really? Are you sure you're useful, not just afraid to die? Istve had to fight back a slightly bitter smile. Their whole life, that had always been the question. Iran was brilliant. Istve knew it as well as anyone, and Istve honestly didn't mind not taking any of the credit. For all he hated it, Iran deserved every bit of fame he had, every word of praise he received. Istve, the former homeless child, the research assistant, whatever the hell people called them, Istve was always the afterthought. And Istve had never minded, not as long as Iran was the one getting the credit. Because, well, damn it, because Iran was brilliant. Because Iran was everything. Iran deserved the whole damn world. Istve had known that, instinctually, since they were 5 years old and had crouched down beside the child crying in the street in the rain and looked into the tear-streaked face of the most beautiful boy they'd ever seen. But this one time, Istve had to convince someone they were worth something themselves, on their own merits, not because of Iran or anyone else. Istve shook their head gingerly, wincing at the wave of pain the movement brought. No, they muttered. Listen, you're facing a leadership crisis? Fine, but I've watched you. This whole time you've been after us. Your crew may be good, but they're inefficient as hell. I study systems. I'd be willing to bet I could get your ship running twice as efficiently as it is now, which gives you time to deal with whatever the hell the rest of the raiders will do to kick you off your throne. They paused. And think what kind of pull that would give you. You have Krivai's former crew working for you. That has to mean something. She quirked an eyebrow at them. You'd help me? There's going to be a war for leadership. You'd have to renounce your loyalty to Krivai. But if you did that, like you say, it looks impressive at least. Istve forced themselves to meet her eyes. There was a time, not too long ago, that the thought of a leadership war, whatever that meant, would have meant something to Istve. When they might have told Iran, if he were here, that their own life wasn't that important. When they might have, in Iran's words, been a self-sacrificing idiot. But that had been before. Before Istve had let themselves realize how much they meant to Iran, how much losing them would hurt him. Before they'd realized to what lengths they'd go to keep Iran from being hurt. Before they'd kissed Iran, and finally admitted to themselves how desperately much they wanted to live. The raider captain studied Istve for a few moments. And I'm supposed to believe you. They didn't drop her gaze. Try me. If you find I'm not useful, you can kill me then. At last, she gave a brusque nod. I suppose it won't hurt to try. I'll give you a chance, but best hope you can do what you promise. She shot them a toothy smile, then turned to leave. I'll send someone in to cut your restraints, and you can get to work. But it might be a few hours. I have to make sure we're out of range of Krivai and his people first. Then she was gone. Istve stared after her. Their stomachs still churned with nausea, their heads spinning, and pain throbbed in all the places they'd been injured. They closed their eyes and leaned back against the wall, pushing back against the hopelessness. It didn't matter. They were going to survive this. They had to. Somehow, they'd stay alive long enough to find a way to get back to Iran, no matter what it took. Istvay could still feel Iran's lips against theirs, warm and soft, the way the sensation had jolted through their entire body. Iran's hands on their hips, his fingers tightening, pulling Istvay closer. Istvay's hands tangled in the warmth of Iran's hair. The way Iran's breath had quickened, the taste of him on Istvay's lips, the rough brush of his short beard against Istvay's skin, just like how Istvay had remembered, how they'd dreamed about every damn night for more years than they really wanted to admit, how close to unbearable it had been to pull back, finally break off the kiss. The look on Iran's face when they had, his eyes wide and dark with a mixture of wonder and desire, that small, disbelieving smile tugging at the corners of his lips, something bright and light inside him that almost glowed through his skin. The way he'd looked at Istvay as if Istvay was every dream he'd ever had finally come true. They would find Iran. They would see that look again, and they'd finally damn well tell him. Istvay blinked their eyes open again. They'd promised. They'd promised Iran, and this was a promise they were damn well going to keep, even if it meant setting the whole system on fire. The end.